spent 31 years as a paramedic in Columbus, Ohio. 31 years of running toward the worst moments of other people's lives, keeping them alive long enough to hand them off to someone who could do more. I retired at 62 with bad knees, a decent pension, and the kind of quiet that takes some getting used to after 3 decades of sirens. My wife, Eleanor, passed 4 years before I retired. Ovarian cancer. 7 months from diagnosis to the end. We'd been married 38 years, raised 2 kids in the same house on Brentwood Avenue, where I'd lived ever since. My son, Kevin, lives 40 minutes north in Westerville, with his wife and my 2 grandkids. My daughter, Diane, married a man named Stuart 8 years ago. And for a while, things seemed fine. For a while. I should say up front that I'm not a man who asks for help easily. Eleanor used to say I'd sooner drive lost for an hour than pull over and ask directions. She wasn't wrong. So when Diane started suggesting that maybe I needed some support after Mum passed, I didn't think much of it. She's my daughter. She worries. That's what daughters do. What I didn't understand then, what I understand completely now, is that there's a difference between worrying about someone and deciding you know better than they do how their life should go. It started small. Stuart lost his job at the logistics company where he'd worked for 6 years. He said the market was rough, that layoffs were happening everywhere, that he'd find something soon. Diane called me in March, 2.5 years ago, and asked if they could stay with me for a few months while they got back on their feet. Their apartment lease was up. They needed time to save. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She's my daughter. They moved in on a Saturday with 2 cars full of boxes and Stuart's brother's truck piled high with furniture. I had to rearrange my own garage to fit. I gave them the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, the one Eleanor and I had shared for 30 years, because the guest room was too small for 2 people. I moved my things to the guest room. I told myself it was temporary. Within 3 weeks, Diane had reorganized my kitchen. She said it made more sense her way. I let it go. Within 6 weeks, Stuart had started receiving packages at my address. Business stuff, he said. He was starting something online. I let that go too. By month 3, I noticed my mail was being opened before I got to it. Bills, statements, a letter from my financial advisor. Diane said she was just keeping an eye on things, that she was worried about me being on top of my finances, since Eleanor used to handle a lot of that. Eleanor did handle most of the paperwork, true, but I wasn't incompetent. I was grieving, and there's a difference. I started paying closer attention. Stuart wasn't starting an online business. I found that out when I overheard a phone call he didn't know I could hear. I was in the backyard near the kitchen window, weeding the garden Eleanor had planted the year before she got sick. I could hear him clearly through the screen. He was talking about a property, not a property he owned, mine. He said something about the old man's equity and timing the market right. He said Diane's working on him. He laughed at something the person on the other end said. I stood in Eleanor's garden with dirt on my hands and felt something go cold in my chest. Not panic, something steadier than panic. The thing that took over when I showed up to a bad accident scene and everything around me was chaos. But inside I went very still. I went inside. I made a sandwich. I acted like I hadn't heard anything. That night I called Kevin. He came over the next afternoon while Diane and Stuart were both out. I told him what I'd heard. I watched his face go through several expressions before it settled on something serious. Dad, he said, how much do they know about your finances? More than I'd realized, as it turned out. The opened mail. The time Diane had borrowed my laptop to check her email and been on it for 2 hours. The conversation she'd had with my financial advisor, which I hadn't authorized, but which the advisor had taken at face value, because she said she was my daughter helping me manage things. Kevin is an engineer. He thinks in systems, in problems and solutions. He sat at my kitchen table and asked me questions for an hour. What accounts did they have access to? Had I signed anything recently? Had anyone mentioned a power of attorney? That last one hit me. 3 months earlier, Diane had mentioned, casually, over dinner, that it might be smart for me to set up a power of attorney just in case something happens. She'd even brought home a packet of papers. I'd set them aside without signing. I hadn't thought about it again until Kevin mentioned it. I went and found the packet. Kevin looked at it for a long time. "Dad," he said carefully, "this isn't a standard POA template. Some of this language is wrong, or not wrong, but it's broader than it should be. A lot broader." I asked him what that meant. He said it meant that if I'd signed it, Diane and Stuart would have had near total authority over my finances, my property, and my medical decisions, not as a backup for emergencies, as a primary authority. I sat with that for a while. My daughter had brought papers into my house designed to hand over control of my life. Kevin wanted to call a lawyer immediately. I said, "Give me a few days." He didn't like it, but he knew me well enough not to push. I spent those few days watching, paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before, because letting yourself see something like that about your own child takes a kind of courage that doesn't come easy. Stuart was on his phone constantly, but always somewhere private. He'd stepped outside when I came downstairs unexpectedly twice. Diane had started talking to me more about my health, asking questions about my knee pain, whether I was sleeping okay, whether I'd seen my doctor lately. It felt like she was building something. A record. A case. Then Kevin called me on a Tuesday night. His voice was different. Quieter. "Dad, I need you to listen to me carefully. I talked to a friend of mine today. Someone I went to Ohio State with. He's a white-collar crimes investigator now. Works with the state AG's office." He paused. "Stuart has a record, Dad. Nothing that ended in conviction. But there are 2 civil suits against him from the past 5 years. Both involve elderly individuals. Both involve allegations of financial fraud and property theft." I put the phone down on the counter for a second and looked out the window at Eleanor's garden. "Dad, you still there? I'm here. You need to get them out of your house. But you need to do it right. Do you understand what I'm saying? You have to do this carefully." I understood completely. 31 years as a paramedic taught me that sometimes you have to slow down to move fast. You assess before you act. You don't rush into a scene and make it worse. I called an attorney the next morning, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who'd been recommended by the attorney who handled Eleanor's estate. I drove to her office alone and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a few precise questions and then folded her hands on her desk. "Mr. Rebus Hargrove," she said, "what you're describing is a pattern consistent with predatory guardianship fraud. Your son-in-law's background makes this significantly more concerning. I want you to do some things before we file anything." She told me to open a new bank account at a different institution, one Diane and Stuart had no knowledge of, and begin moving assets there. She told me to change my financial advisor's instructions to require written authorization from me directly for any family member to access my records. She told me not to sign anything. She told me to document everything I could remember. Dates, conversations, the opened mail, all of it, and to let Kevin know what we were doing. She also told me to consult with a private investigator. I went home that afternoon and acted like nothing had changed. I'm not proud of how naturally that came. The investigator Kevin connected me with worked fast. Within 2 weeks, he had enough for Patricia to take seriously. Stuart was involved in a scheme involving fraudulent property transfers. He had a connection to a title company in Cincinnati that had been under informal scrutiny for deed irregularities. 3 other families in Ohio had been targeted using variations of the same approach. Move in under the pretense of needing help. Build trust. Document the elderly relative's perceived vulnerability. Obtain financial authority. Transfer assets. I was going to be the 4th. On a Friday night in November, Kevin called me at 11:30. I was already awake. I'd been sleeping poorly since all of this started. "Dad." His voice was steady, but I could hear something underneath it. The investigator talked to a contact at the county sheriff's office today. They've been watching Stuart separately. There's going to be movement soon. You need to be somewhere else this weekend. Come stay with me. I didn't ask questions. I'd raised him to be straightforward, and he was. I packed a bag while Diane and Stuart were asleep. I want to be honest about what that felt like. I was in my own house, packing a bag in the dark to escape from my daughter. I stood in the hallway outside the guest room I was sleeping in a house I'd owned for 30 years, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Eleanor's last week. A grief that doesn't have a clean name. I drove to Kevin's before sunrise. On Sunday afternoon, 2 sheriff's deputies and a detective from the county fraud unit came to my house on Brentwood Avenue. Diane called me while it was happening. I didn't answer. She called 4 more times. Then Stuart called 4 more times. Then Stuart called twice. I sat in Kevin's kitchen with a cup of coffee and watched my phone light up and let it go to voicemail. Kevin's wife Sandra made dinner. My grandkids didn't know anything was wrong. The younger one asked me to help with a puzzle after dinner, and I sat on the living room floor and put together a 100-piece puzzle of a covered bridge while my life rearranged itself somewhere across town. Stuart was taken into custody that evening. Charges involving the fraudulent title company, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse under Ohio law, and several counts relating to the other families whose cases had been building longer than mine. I found all of this out in pieces over the following days, from Kevin, from Patricia Holloway, from a detective who called to take my statement. Diane was not charged, not initially. There wasn't enough to establish that she knew the full scope of what Stuart was doing. Maybe that was true. Maybe she told herself, the way people do, that it wasn't really what it looked like, that she was just helping her husband, that she wasn't really hurting anyone. I don't know what she told herself. I only know what she did. She came to Kevin's house 3 days later. I saw her through the window, standing on the front porch in a coat I recognized from 2 Christmases ago, when things were still ordinary. She looked smaller than I remembered her. She'd been crying recently, you could see it. Kevin asked me what I wanted to do. I said, let her in. She sat across from me at Kevin's kitchen table. Kevin stayed in the room. She didn't object to that. Dad, she said. And then she stopped. Whatever she planned to say, it didn't come out right away. She looked at the table. I didn't know about the other families. I swear I didn't know any of that. But you knew about the papers you brought home. She didn't answer immediately. That was its own kind of answer. I thought it was to protect you, she said. Stuart said it was just in case something happened to you so we can take care of things. He said the same thing to at least 2 other families, Diane. She closed her eyes. And you opened my mail, I said. You talked to my financial advisor without telling me. You had a conversation in this house that I heard, where your husband talked about my equity and my property like I was a transaction. I didn't know he was. Did you know something was wrong? The question sat between us. Kevin shifted in his chair but didn't say anything. Diane's hands were folded on the table. After a long moment, she said quietly, I knew something wasn't exactly right. I told myself it was fine. There it is. That's the thing. Not that she didn't love me. I believe she loved me in the way people love things they've decided belong to them. But she knew. Some part of her knew. And she decided not to look at it directly. I thought about 31 years of emergencies. About the times I'd seen families in crisis, how easy it is to stop seeing a person when they're in a situation and start seeing a problem to manage. I wondered when I became a problem to manage in my daughter's mind. What do you want from me? I asked. She looked up. Her eyes were red. I just want you to know I'm sorry. And I want to know if there's any way. No, I said. Not harshly. Just clearly. Not right now. Not for a long time, if ever. You brought a man into my house who has done this to other families. You watched him operate on me, and you told yourself it was fine. I can't move past that in a conversation. She nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the same way she'd done since she was little. That was hard to see. What I need from you, I said, is to handle your situation honestly. Whatever happens with Stuart, whatever happens with the legal process, don't hide from it. And get some help. Figure out how you got to a place where this was something you could let happen. Because I raised you better than that, and somewhere in there I believe you know it." She left. Kevin walked her out. I stayed at the table and looked at Eleanor's photograph on the refrigerator. The one Kevin keeps up from a camping trip we all took to Hocking Hills years ago. Eleanor is laughing at something off camera, her hair blowing sideways. I thought about what she would say. She would say, "You did what you had to do." And then she'd say, "Now do what's hard." I went back to Brentwood Avenue 2 weeks later after the locks had been changed and a security system installed. Walking back into my own house felt strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. The kitchen was still organized Diane's way. I stood in the doorway and looked at it. Then I spent 3 hours putting it back the way Eleanor and I had always kept it. The legal process moved on its own schedule. Stuart's case built slowly but steadily. 3 other victims, all in Ohio, all over 65, all targeted through a version of the same approach. 2 cases involved actual property transfer that the families were still fighting to reverse. Mine had been stopped before it got that far, which Patricia told me was fortunate. There were mornings in that winter when I'd sit with my coffee before it was fully light and let myself feel the full weight of it. My daughter. In my house. And the hardest part wasn't the anger, it was the embarrassment. The feeling that I should have seen it sooner, that a man who'd spent his career reading emergency scenes had missed the emergency in his own kitchen. Patricia talked me out of that thinking during one of our meetings. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "these schemes work specifically because they target people who love the perpetrators. It's not a failure of perception. It's exploitation of trust. If you'd been a stranger, your radar would have been up immediately." She was right. I knew she was right. It still took some time to settle in. Diane called occasionally over the following months. I didn't always answer. When I did, the conversations were short. She was seeing a counselor. She'd moved in with a friend from her old job. She was working part-time at a dental office. Stuart's trial was progressing. She wasn't being called as a witness for the prosecution, but she wasn't defending him either. I didn't respond to most of what she said. I listened. That was what I could manage. Kevin came by most weekends. Sometimes just for an hour. Sometimes with Sandra and the kids. My granddaughter started helping me in the garden in spring. She's 8, precise about things in a way that reminded me of Kevin at that age. She has opinions about where the tomatoes should go. One Saturday in April, Kevin and I were sitting on the back porch after the kids had gone in, and he said, "You know you could have lost everything." "I know. I keep thinking about if you'd signed those papers." "I didn't." "No." He looked at the garden. "You didn't." He picked up his coffee cup. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I know that sounds strange to say to your father, but I mean it." I didn't say anything for a minute. The evening was warm enough to sit outside for the first time that year. Eleanor's rose bushes along the back fence were starting to come in. "Your mother would have spotted it faster," I said. Kevin laughed. "Probably in about 48 hours. 48 is generous. I'd say 24. We sat out there until the light went. It was the first evening in a long time that felt like something other than aftermath. Stuart was sentenced in June. 14 years on the fraud and financial elder abuse charges, with mandatory minimum requirements under Ohio's elder abuse enhancement statutes. Restitution ordered to all 4 targeted families, including $95,000 to me for documented financial exploitation and legal costs. The title company he'd worked with was under separate investigation. Patricia called me when it was over. "It's done," she said. "Thank you," I said. "You did the hard part," she said. "Most people in your situation don't act fast enough. You did." I thought about Kevin's call on that Friday night. 11:30. His steady voice, the careful way he'd laid out what needed to happen. I'd raised that kid on the belief that you do the job in front of you and you don't flinch from it. He'd carried that into adulthood in ways I hadn't expected. I drove past the courthouse on my way home from Patricia's office. I didn't stop. There was nothing left for me there. What I came home to was my house. My kitchen back in order. Eleanor's garden coming in strong. 22 years of photographs on the walls, all the evidence of a life that was still mine. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea and a yellow notepad and started writing down what I knew about the rose bushes, which ones needed to be moved before next spring, which needed pruning, which were doing fine where they were. Practical notes. The kind Eleanor used to leave herself. Diane sent a card in July. No return address, but I recognized her handwriting, the same looping cursive she'd had since middle school. It said she was sorry. That she was sorry. That she was still in counseling. That she'd made her first payment toward the restitution her attorney had negotiated on her behalf. A smaller amount separate from Stuart's, reflecting her limited knowledge and limited participation. She said she didn't expect a response. I put the card on the kitchen windowsill above Eleanor's photograph. It wasn't forgiveness. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is a process, not a moment, and I was not at the end of it. Maybe I'd get there eventually. Maybe not. I was 66 years old, and I had stopped pretending I knew how things were going to end. What I knew was this. I still had my house, my pension, my independence, my garden, my son who drove 40 minutes on weekends and sat with me on the back porch until the light went, my granddaughter who had opinions about tomatoes. I knew that I'd been a paramedic for 31 years because when things went wrong, I went toward them instead of away. And when it mattered most, in my own life, in my own house, I'd done the same thing. Some mornings I'd go out to the garden early before it got hot and work for an hour before breakfast. Eleanor's roses bloomed in July, deep red along the back fence, the same color they'd always been. I'd stand there with my coffee and look at them and feel something that I'd stopped being able to name precisely. Not happiness exactly, not grief exactly. Something more like steadiness. Like a pulse that's been irregular and then evens out, like someone who's been running toward emergencies for a long time, and finally, on a quiet morning, gets to just stand still. Time has a way of sorting things that you can't sort yourself. I'd learned that from 31 years of other people's worst days, and I'd learned it again from the worst chapter of my own. You survive it. You keep your feet. You protect what's yours. And you get back to living, which is the only real answer to people who tried to take it from you. I wound the old mantel clock Eleanor had bought at an estate sale in 2003, the one she'd loved for no reason she could ever quite explain. It had always kept good time. I set it back on the shelf where it belonged, listened to it tick, and went out to check on the roses. If you found something in this story that you needed to hear, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a comment below and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I've thought a lot about how things unravel. Not all at once. That's not how it works. It happens in small allowances. A door left open that should have been closed. A question not asked because asking it felt rude. A signature almost given because the person handing you the pen was your own child. That's what nearly happened to me. Not because I was foolish. Because I was trusting. And there's a version of the world where those two things aren't that different. Stuart didn't walk into my house as an enemy. He walked in as my son-in-law, as someone I'd shaken hands with at a wedding, as someone I'd sat across from at Thanksgiving. The scheme he ran wasn't sophisticated because of some genius in the planning. It was sophisticated because it ran on something I wasn't guarding, my love for my daughter. That was the open door. That's what people like him look for. What I've come to understand is that cause and consequence don't always show up on the same day. Stuart made choices over years. Against me, against 3 other families, against people who trusted him the same way I did, and those choices compounded. Every one of them added weight to what was eventually going to come down. It came down. 14 years and a restitution order and a record that follows him the rest of his life. That's not luck. That's arithmetic. Diane's consequences were quieter, and in some ways harder to watch. She didn't go to prison. She went to a smaller life, a friend's couch, a part-time job, monthly payments, a counselor's office 3 times a week. She's building something back, slowly. Whether it becomes something worth having depends entirely on her, on whether she has the honesty to look directly at what she let herself become, and the will to become something else instead. I hope she does. I genuinely hope she does. But hope isn't the same as certainty, and I've stopped confusing the two. Kevin is the part of this story I think about the most. Not because of what he did, though what he did matters. He drove over on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at my kitchen table and asked me the right questions. He made the calls. He stayed steady when I needed steadiness more than I needed sympathy. I raised him to do a job when a job needed doing, without drama, without waiting for someone else to step up. He carried that. There's nothing more a parent can ask. What I learned, and I mean learned, not just knew, is that protecting yourself isn't a betrayal of love. Loving someone doesn't obligate you to hand them everything they reach for. It doesn't mean absorbing whatever harm they're willing to cause, because the alternative is conflict. I spent 31 years running into situations where someone had to make hard calls fast, and the ones who froze were always the ones who confused action with cruelty. They're not the same thing. I still get up early. I still go out to Eleanor's garden before the heat comes in. The roses along the back fence came in strong this July. Same deep red they've always been. I stand there with my coffee, and I feel something I don't have a clean word for. Not triumph. Not peace exactly. Something more like evenness, like a man who knows what he's worth and stopped letting other people set the price. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not just the story of what happened, but the fact that it's possible to go through something like this and come out holding what matters. Your name. Your house. Your clarity. The people who showed up when it counted. Those things are worth protecting. And you're never too old and never too tired to protect them.